jazz legend Charlie Bird Parker is supposed to have said, "Don't play the saxophone, let it play you." From the time I was about 11, I started playing music. I went to college to study composition, contemplating a life, however, as a penniless artist, striving for recognition. I decided that would be too easy and lucrative, so I changed my major to philosophy. Good move. Since that time, I have been looking for ways to unite these two passions. And in the last couple of years, I've started working with rock and pop and electronic hip-hop musicians from places in the world where they are not fully free to do their thing, and they struggle against political, cultural, and religious constraints. And thinking about their experiences and listening to their stories, I began to reflect on some philosophical lessons of music. In particular, the ways that music teaches about the nature of freedom and the nature of the self. In particular, I think that music explodes a popular traditional idea of the self, that you are essentially the I of the first person singular, the conscious will that voluntarily chooses to do things. And secondly, I think it explodes an associated notion of freedom, that freedom lies in the control of this conscious will over itself and over its surroundings. And in place of these traditional ideas, music directs us to what you might call an embodied model of freedom and the self. One which says, in place of the idea of freedom as control, says that freedom is a kind of openness. Openness to being moved by the right forces. Not so much the freedom to choose, but the freedom to be chosen. In place of the idea of the self as the conscious will, it directs us to a more fuller notion of the self as an activity of the body, an activity of the whole person. Now, here's another legendary horn player whom you may not recognize. This is Marsyas from ancient Greek mythology, who hails from the eastern province of Phrygia, a devotee of Dionysus, the god of wine and excess. The instrument he's holding there is often translated as flute, but it is in fact the aulos, a kind of reed instrument with reed mouthpieces fit in two resonating pipes made of ivory or horn or bone. According to legend, the goddess Athena picks up the aulos, but after seeing how, in her reflection of her face in a river, its playing distorts her features, she casts it away in disgust, saying, "Away, shameful thing, an affront to my body." Marsyas here picks it up and blows. We all encounter music as embodied biological creatures. This is true as performers, as listeners, and of the musical event as a whole. For the performer, knowledge of music is first and foremost a knowledge that belongs to the body. It's in the fingers, it's in the hands, in the arms, in the throat, the lips. Psychologists now tell us that skilled performers enter a state of flow, this state of subjectively effortless attention that comes in skilled performance. The conscious will, notice here, is not in charge of Charlie Parker's improvised solo. Now, no doubt it was involved in those tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of concerted hours of rehearsal leading up to it. But even there, the job of the conscious will is to eventually make itself disappear in the flow. Does that mean that Bird didn't play his solo? No, of course not. It means that we must expand our notion of who he is, expand our notion of the self beyond just the conscious will. So you might say the job of the conscious will is to make itself disappear in the flow. Who's playing? The whole self, and that includes the body. Now, for listeners, music commands, it compels attention. We hear in music intention and emotion. Not just happiness and sadness, but serenity, resolve, anxiety, fear, rage, even humor can be expressed in music. And cross-cultural surveys show that there's a remarkable agreement and convergence around the world in which sounds people interpret in terms of which emotions. Now, why should this be? How could this be that musical material can express these complex emotions? It's surely a great scientific puzzle of our time. And surely one piece of it is our social brain, evolved for empathy with others. In the last 2 decades, neuroscience has been buzzing about mirror neurons, these exquisitely sophisticated systems of brain circuits that give us an immediate understanding of the complex states of minds of others, their intentions and purposes and desires. So when we see an action being performed by someone else, our brain lights up in the same regions that would light up if we were to perform that action ourselves. Now, recent work has shown that what is true for vision is also true for hearing, thanks to a system of auditory mirror neurons, or what might be better called echo neurons. We hear others in sound. We don't just hear, for example, the sound of a piece of paper tearing, but we hear someone tearing a piece of paper. We understand the sound immediately in terms of the intentions and desires and purposes of another. Now, notice again that the conscious will is not in charge here. We cannot help but hear emotion and intention in music. We cannot but be resonating along with it. It strikes a chord deep in our neurobiology. Now, does this mean that we are not free in our experience of music? Quite the contrary. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer observed that the freedom, the sense of liberation we experience in music is not the mastery of the conscious will over its surroundings, but it's the escape from willing, the liberation of the will, and the surrender of control to the direction of the sounds. This, I would submit, is a fuller sense of freedom. Now, what's true of the performer and listener is true also of the musical event itself, I would say. A musical event involving a performer, an audience, and some space for their interaction is essentially a public event. It's constituted, it exists only in a social environment made up of rules and norms, expectation, habits, custom, and these aren't up to the individual. They are parts of traditions that we simply find ourselves within. This is true even for a great innovator like Charlie Parker. The musical event is essentially a public event. Now, when I was a young garage band rocker, and mind you, this was the 1980s, so I'm not talking about the Mac software, but an actual building with a cement floor where you keep old paint cans. I used to think that the practice of musical notation, reading notes off a page, was somehow an impediment to the creative self-expression of the individual, right? Because it seem to make the player into a machine for reproducing the thoughts of others. But of course, this was a naive and shallow notion of self-expression. So if you think about it, what the technology of musical notation really does is creates a device for inserting new behaviors into your musical repertoire, which prevents you from playing the thing you already know how to play over and over again. This is the opposite of making you more mechanical. This is actually making you less mechanical. And this, I would submit, is again a fuller notion of freedom and the self. It's a way to turn our very bodies into vessels for forces greater and more beautiful than ourselves. Now, I think it's precisely because of the involuntary, the bodily character of music that it has been threatening to many philosophers, not the least of which was Plato here. Plato, in his great dialogue, The Republic, which lays out his plan for the ideal social and political community, the Callipolis, or beautiful city, spends a great deal of time talking about music and musical instruction, which he believes is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul. He actually went so far as to discuss individual musical modes, or scales as we might call them, saying that some ought to be forbidden because they would bring up people the wrong way. They would teach and train the wrong states and traits and character. The Ionian and Lydian modes, he said, which are not so far away from our own major scale, were too soft and indolent. They were fitting only for women, said Plato. He even wanted to ban certain musical instruments. Remember the aulos. Here we see Marsyas in all his full glory, challenging Apollo here, as you may know, the god of reason, to a musical showdown. Apollo is playing what is probably a kitara. It's a large virtuoso type of the family of the lyre, something like a harp, from which, of course, our word guitar ultimately derives. According to the story, the Muses were the judge of this musical contest, and Marsyas came out the loser and was flayed alive, skinned by that knife you see there as his punishment. Now, one reason Plato was suspicious of the aulos was that its design allowed you to play all the musical modes easily in one sitting, and therefore some of the forbidden musical modes, like the Lydian and Ionian. But perhaps there was a more fundamental reason why he and other ancients were suspicious of this instrument. And that is that it seemed to undermine the rationalist model of freedom and the self, its control of the conscious will. So you can see in this contest, really, clash between kind of Platonic rationalism and the embodiment of Marsyas and his aulos. In Plato's famous metaphor, the soul is like a chariot that is pulled along by two horses. One is appetite or desire, which is concerned with bodily needs and pleasures. The other horse is the horse of spirit, which is concerned with courage and valor and other virtues. They are driven, of course, by the chariot master, the charioteer, who stands tall. That's reason. Reason steers and holds desire and spirit, and so is the master of the soul. And as Apollo there is the master of his instrument, serenely plucking away without losing his composure, while Marsyas dances nude, contorting his face in his musical ecstasy. Plutarch, in his life of Alcibiades, who would go on to become a statesman, said in his youth he shunned the lyre for this reason. Or, sorry, he shunned the aulos and preferred the lyre for this reason. That the lyre blended its tones with the voice or song of its master. You could sing or speak while plucking it, whereas the aulos barricaded the mouth, robbing its master, both of voice and of speech. Now, according to the story, Apollo did triumph, but it wasn't through merit or musical skill or beauty, but actually through cheap stagecraft. He turned his guitar upside down and kept plucking, a feat which Marsyas couldn't accomplish on the aulos, connected as it must be to the body. Now, as I said, in the last couple of years, I've been looking at ways that people have tried to control music. And as the story of Marsyas and Plato shows, attempts to control music are as old as music itself. And I've suggested that's because music is, by its very nature, about control. The control of the body, the control of the will, the control of the public space. And in 2010, I launched this project, the Impossible Music Sessions, which is an attempt to bring to the stage music that can't exist somewhere. Music that is not too difficult to play, but too controversial to play, and so faces political, cultural, or religious pressure. We bring this music to the stage by uniting, creating a collaboration between the banned artist, the censored artist, and an artist who can appear in their stead in solidarity, who plays their music live on stage in Brooklyn, New York. The point here, of course, is not only to showcase their music, but to defend the human right to freedom of musical expression. It's interesting that many of these musicians already enjoy the freedom to distribute their tracks online, out of their basement studios, but they long for the bodily experience of coming together in an analog performance and sharing their music. In doing this work, I've had a partnership with FreeMuse, which you can find at freemuse.org, the leading defender of the human rights of musicians. One of the artists I had the pleasure of working with, a young woman from Iran, whom I'll not name, who had the audacity to sing in front of mixed-gender audiences in English nonetheless, violating the laws of her country, even went to prison for it. When I asked her why she did this despite all the risks, she responded that she felt she was compelled. She was chosen. I have to find a way to do it, she said. Music is my life. Thank you.